The first time my father stood in front of me in a courtroom, he did not look like my father. He looked like a stranger. He stood 3 tables away from the bench in a dark gray suit, his hands folded tightly in front of him, his face older than I remembered, his hair almost completely white, and for a few seconds, neither of us moved. Then the clerk read the case number, and my stomach dropped, because the name on the file was his. The courtroom suddenly felt too small. I had spent 20 years learning how to keep my face calm, while people argued, accused, begged, and lied in front of me. I knew how to separate emotion from evidence. I knew how to make decisions based on facts instead of family history. But I had never imagined sitting behind the bench while my own father stood on the other side of the room asking the court to recognize what he claimed was his rightful inheritance. When I looked down at the file, I saw the name of the property at the center of the dispute. The house where I had grown up, the house my mother had told me belonged to our family. The house I had been told was gone forever after my father walked away from us 30 years earlier. My father looked directly at me, and then he said something that made my heart stop. "Your Honor," he whispered, "I did not come here to take anything from you." He paused. "I came because somebody stole your life from you." I did not understand what he meant. Not then, but by the end of that case, I would discover that almost everything I believed about my childhood had been built on a carefully maintained lie. And the people I had trusted most had spent 3 decades making sure I never asked the right questions. My name is Claire Morgan. I was 46 years old when all of this happened. By then, I had been a judge in a county court in Connecticut for nearly 6 years. Before that, I spent 14 years as an attorney working mostly on property disputes, probate matters, and family cases. People sometimes assume judges are naturally calm. We are not. We simply learn how to hide the storm. I grew up in a small town called Belhaven with my mother, Evelyn, and my father, Daniel. At least, that was the family story. According to my mother, my father had been a selfish man who became obsessed with money. According to her, he had left when I was 16 because he wanted a different life. He moved across the state. He stopped calling. He stopped sending birthday cards. He barely remembered holidays. And when I asked why, my mother always gave me the same answer. Some people love themselves more than they love their families. I believed her. For 30 years, I believed her. I remember the night my father left. I was 16. There had been an argument in the kitchen. I could not hear every word from my bedroom, but I remember my mother crying. I remember my father saying, "This is not what I wanted." Then I heard the front door close. I ran downstairs. My mother was standing beside the kitchen counter with both hands pressed against her face. "Where's Dad?" She looked at me. "He's gone." "Gone where?" She shook her head. "I don't know." I remember staring through the front window as his car disappeared down the street. I remember running outside without shoes. I remember screaming his name, but he never stopped. At least that was how I remembered it, or how I thought I remembered it. After that night, my mother became fiercely protective of me. She worked 2 jobs. She packed my lunches. She attended every school event. She told me she wanted me to become strong enough that no one could ever abandon me again. When I went to college, she sold the house and moved into a smaller apartment. She told me the house had too many memories. I never questioned her. I never questioned anything. When I became an attorney, she proudly told everyone that her daughter had built the life her father never believed she could. When I became a judge, she cried at the ceremony, "You did it without him," she whispered. I thought she meant that as praise. Now I know it was something else. It was fear. Fear that someday I might discover what she had spent decades hiding. The case began with a complaint filed by my father against my uncle, Richard Morgan. Richard was my father's younger brother. He had always been around after my father disappeared. He came to holidays. He brought groceries when my mother was sick. He helped fix the plumbing. He paid for my college application fees when my mother was struggling. Growing up, I thought Uncle Richard was the good man who stayed when my father left. That was another thing I had gotten wrong. The property involved in the case was an old 22-acre parcel just outside Belhaven. Part of it had belonged to my grandfather, Thomas Morgan. My grandfather had died before I was born. I had only vague memories of his face from photographs. According to my mother, he left almost everything to my father. But apparently, There had been a private family arrangement that transferred the property to Richard after my grandfather died. That was what the paperwork showed. At least, the paperwork I had grown up hearing about. My father claimed the transfer had never been legitimate. He said my grandfather intended the property to remain with him. He claimed certain documents had been altered after the estate was settled, and most importantly, he claimed that a trust had been created for me when I was a child. A trust worth far more than anyone in my family had ever admitted. When I first read that part, I thought there had been a mistake. I called my clerk into chambers. "Are you sure this is the same Daniel Morgan?" She nodded. "Yes, Judge." I stared at the file. Did he actually file this himself? Through counsel, I leaned back. Does he know who I am? My clerk gave me a strange look. He specifically identified you as the presiding judge. My chest tightened. I asked for a recess. Then I went home. My mother was sitting at my kitchen table when I arrived. I had called her on the drive. She knew something was wrong. "What happened?" she asked. I put the file on the table. Her eyes moved to the cover. Then she went completely still. "You saw him?" It was not a question. I frowned. "You knew?" She looked away. "I knew he might come back someday." I felt something cold move through me. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I wanted to protect you." "From what?" She did not answer. I pushed the file toward her. "Mom, he says there was a trust created for me." Her hands began to tremble. "That is not real. Did Dad create one?" "No. Are you sure?" "Yes." I stared at her. She looked terrified. Not angry. Not offended. Terrified. And that was the first moment I realized my father might not be the person I had been taught to hate. I asked her one more question. "Why is Uncle Richard listed in the case?" Her face changed. Just slightly. But I noticed. My entire career had trained me to notice small changes. "He has nothing to do with this," she said. "Then why is he named?" "I don't know." "You're lying." She stood so quickly the chair moved backward. "Claire, tell me the truth." "I have told you the truth your entire life." "No," I said quietly. "You told me your version." She looked at me, and for the first time in my life, I saw my mother as a woman who was afraid of something she could not control. She left without saying goodbye. The next morning, I appeared in court. I had already requested an ethics review to determine whether I should recuse myself. The legal counsel assigned to advise me told me that because the dispute involved my immediate family and property in which I could potentially have a financial interest, I should not personally rule on the case. That decision protected the integrity of the court, so a temporary judge was appointed to handle procedural matters. But because I was connected to the case in a personal way, I was still permitted to review non-substantive records concerning whether the matter should be transferred. That was when the first real surprise appeared. A sealed probate file from 30 years earlier had been requested. My father's attorney said it contained evidence. The file was from my grandfather's estate. When it arrived, it had a red seal across the front. The date was 30 years ago, 2 weeks before my father disappeared. I sat in chambers staring at the envelope for almost 10 minutes. Then I opened it. Inside were old property records, tax documents, and handwritten notes. Near the back was a copy of a trust agreement. My name was on it. I read the sentence 3 times. A trust had been created for me when I was 12 years old. The document stated that my grandfather had placed a portion of his property and investment accounts into a trust for my education and future housing. The trustee was not my father. It was my Uncle Richard. And the document stated that if my father were ever unable to act on my behalf, Richard was to manage the trust until I turned 30. My hands went cold. I kept reading. There was another clause. If the property were sold before I turned 30, the proceeds were to remain in the trust. But there was a handwritten notation across the final page. Trust terminated. No signature from the original trustee. No court order. No explanation. Just 2 words. Trust terminated. I called the clerk. "Who filed this?" She checked the record. "There is no filing history." "What?" She looked again. "The page is in the file, but there is no corresponding termination petition." I felt my pulse in my neck. Someone had written a legal conclusion without a legal process. I asked for the original version. The clerk said there was one more document. A scanned copy. I opened it. The handwriting was different. The words were not "trust terminated." They were. Trust transferred to successor management. Someone had altered the document. The photocopy in the probate file showed different language from the scanned archive. My father's attorney had not even made that discovery yet. I sat there for a long time. Then I called my father's attorney. I need to ask you something. Of course. Did your client know about my trust? There was a pause. Yes. Why didn't anyone tell me? Another pause. Judge Morgan, I think that is the question your father has been waiting 30 years to answer. I stared at the wall. What happened 30 years ago? He said, your father believes your mother and your uncle conspired to remove him from the trust and transfer control of the property. I felt sick. That sounds impossible. I know. No, you don't understand. My mother raised me alone because my father abandoned us. I think your father has a different memory of that night. What memory? He says he never abandoned you. I closed my eyes. What does he say happened? He says he was forced to leave. By whom? He did not answer. I did not ask again. That night, I went back to the old house. The property had been empty for years. My mother had sold it shortly after I left for college. But the new owner had recently died, and the property was tied up in the estate dispute. I stood outside the house, looking at the windows where I used to sit as a teenager. The place felt smaller than I remembered. The front porch creaked beneath my feet. I found an old side entrance unlocked. Inside, the air smelled like dust and old wood. I walked through the kitchen. The same sink, the same hallway, the same staircase, and then I saw a mark on the wall. 3 small pencil lines near the doorway. One for when I was 10, one for 12, one for 14. My mother had written my height beside them. I touched the last mark. Then I heard a floorboard move upstairs. I froze. Hello? No answer. I walked slowly toward the staircase. Another sound. A door closing. I almost called the police. Instead, I climbed the stairs. At the end of the hallway was my old bedroom. The door was slightly open. Inside, a man stood beside the closet. It was my father. I stepped backward. What are you doing here? He turned. I knew you'd come. You've been inside this house? Once. When? 3 days ago. I stared at him. You had no right. He nodded. You're right. You vanished for 30 years. His face tightened. I didn't vanish. Then where were you? He took a breath. I tried to come back. When? Many times. I laughed bitterly. I never saw you. That was the point. What point? He sat on the edge of the old bed. When I left that night, your mother told me you were in danger. I stared at him. What kind of danger? She said Richard had threatened to take you away if I didn't sign certain documents. My heart started pounding. My uncle? Yes. That makes no sense. It didn't to me either. What documents? Property transfers. He looked down. Your grandfather's estate had more money than you were told. I sat across from him. How much? A lot more. How much? Enough that people stopped seeing family as family. That sentence stayed with me. He continued. Your grandfather had created several accounts and investments. Most were meant for you eventually. Richard discovered that some of the trust arrangements were not properly documented. So what? So he saw an opportunity. My father explained that after my grandfather died, Richard took control of the estate paperwork. My father challenged him. The dispute became bitter. Then my mother became involved. My father claimed Richard told my mother that if she supported my father, the family would lose everything. He convinced her that I was trying to take your inheritance. I shook my head. My mother would never do that. My father looked at me. She believed she was protecting you. By keeping me from you? Exactly. That was the part I couldn't understand. Then he told me about the night he left. He said he had discovered that certain property documents had been changed. He confronted Richard. An argument followed. My mother panicked. She told my father that if he did not sign away his interest temporarily, Richard would file a custody action and claim Daniel was unstable and financially irresponsible. My father was furious. I said. He was. Why didn't he fight? Because your mother told him she had proof that could put you in the middle of the dispute. He looked at me. He believed staying would make things worse for you. So he left? He left because he thought it was temporary. I swallowed. What happened after that? Your mother stopped communicating with me. For 30 years? Yes. I never received anything. I sent letters. I never saw them. I sent money. I never received any. My father looked toward the window. I thought your mother was blocking me. I whispered. She was. He nodded. But then something changed in his face. You need to know something else. What? I didn't come back for the property. Then why? Because I found out Richard had been trying to sell part of the land using documents with your name attached. My heart sank. Recently? Yes. How did you find out? Because somebody finally contacted me. Who? He hesitated. A woman named Margaret Lane. I knew that name. Margaret Lane had been my grandfather's accountant. She was 82 years old, and she had been trying to reach me for months. I had ignored the letters because I thought they were about a donation my grandfather had made to a local foundation. That night, I drove straight to her house. She was waiting for me. She opened the door before I knocked. You look like your grandfather, she said. I didn't know you remembered him. I remember everything. Her living room was filled with boxes, old records, ledgers, photographs. She pointed toward a chair. Sit. I sat. She placed a folder in front of me. I've been waiting 30 years to give you this. Inside was a letter from my grandfather. It was addressed to me. I was 12 years old when he wrote it. The first sentence read, My dearest Claire, by the time you read this, you may be old enough to understand why I made certain decisions about our family's property. I looked at Margaret. Why didn't I get this? Because your mother never received it. What? Your grandfather gave it to me before he died. She lowered her voice. He told me that if anything happened to him, I was to give it to you personally when you turned 21. So why didn't you? Because Richard intercepted the trust documents. My hands shook. What did he do? He threatened to destroy the records. How? He said he would accuse me of mishandling your grandfather's accounts. I stared at her. You were afraid. Yes. And you stayed silent. Yes. The honesty in her answer hit harder than a denial would have. She opened another folder. There is more. Inside were copies of bank statements, property tax records, investment statements, transfer agreements, and one document that made everything suddenly make sense. A settlement agreement from 30 years ago. It showed that my father had been offered a small payment in exchange for giving up management rights over the family estate. But the signature on the document was not my father's. It had been copied. My father had never signed it. The document had been used to transfer control to Richard. And there was another name on the page. My mother's. As a witness, I could barely breathe. Margaret watched me. I am sorry. I looked up. Why didn't you stop them? She began to cry. Because I was afraid. Everyone was afraid. Yes. Except Richard. She nodded. He wasn't afraid. I left with the files. The next morning, I met with the appointed judge overseeing the case. I recused myself fully. I told the court everything relevant to my conflict. I disclosed the existence of the trust, my family connection, the property records, and the evidence I had personally received. From that point forward, I was not involved in the legal decisions. I became a witness, a daughter, and finally, a woman trying to understand the past. The case moved quickly after that. Richard's attorney argued that the documents were too old to challenge. They claimed the property had changed hands through lawful procedures, but the records told a different story. A forensic review found that several signatures had been copied. Some financial records had been altered. 2 property transfers had been prepared using outdated versions of legal forms, and the trust had never been properly terminated. In fact, under the original terms, I had become the sole beneficiary when I turned 30. That meant the property and accounts should have been transferred to me years earlier. Richard had spent decades controlling something that was never his to control, but the biggest revelation came from my mother. At first, she refused to testify. She said she was protecting me. Then the court located an old voicemail recording from 30 years earlier. It was from my father. He had left it on my mother's phone the morning after he left. He said he would return when things calmed down. He said he loved me. He said he had never abandoned me. And then he said something I had never heard before. Evelyn, please don't let Richard get near Claire's trust. The recording changed everything. My mother finally agreed to speak. She came to my house one evening.